This podcast contains discussions on sexual misconduct. Topics such as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment may be discussed. Listener discretion is advised, and we encourage self-care and seeking professional support as needed.
In terms of helping people understand what this is, why it is wrong. In some places where corruption is so normalized, trading sex for something of value is just another form of corruption, right? I was interviewing a witness in the OIG. He said, where I come from, you have to use what you have to get what you want, right? It's just not a big deal. And that normalization of sexual exploitation is something that is very hard to work against.
In this episode, I speak to Abigail Averbach, manager of the coordination unit of the Protection from Sexual Exploitation, Abuse, and Harassment at the Global Fund. She tells us about some of the barriers standing in the way of a zero tolerance to sexual misconduct.
We don't typically pick up a telephone and call an anonymous number continent away to report something intimate and traumatic that happened to us, right? We tell our sisters, we tell our mothers, we tell our friends. So there is this aspect of detection that needs to happen. How can we create the trusted, safe places, systems that people will actually use in order to disclose?
She shares with us some of her guiding frameworks as a practitioner, and she underscores the importance of partnership, particularly among international agencies united by a common goal.
Prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships. Partnership sounds like a sort of nice to have, but I think it is a means to the end here. I think we have to figure out how to leverage the respective powers of our organizations and join forces.
This is the #NoExcuse podcast. We discuss the challenges, complexities, and potential solution in preventing and responding to sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the humanitarian and development sectors. You'll hear interviews with victims and survivors, experts, aid workers, artists, and leaders. The podcast is produced by the World Health Organization's Department for the Prevention and Response to Sexual Misconduct. I am Guni Dias, your host and Global PRS Network Coordinator for the department. Abigail Averbach, welcome to the #NoExcuse podcast.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here.
So you are an ethics professional and you manage the protection from sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in the coordination unit of the Global Fund. But you also formerly served as a US prosecutor. What a unique and fascinating background. So I was curious, could you share with us your journey that led you from your role as a US prosecutor to your current position in ethics and PRSEAH at the Global Fund?
So how did I get here? I started out as a daughter of a lawyer, a granddaughter of a lawyer, and I went to law school after having explored other options, thinking this can't be just for lack of imagination, but it really was the thing that I settled on as my calling. But I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. I interned at the U.S. Attorney's Office when I was in law school, and I was exposed to drug dealers, FBI agents, pimps, things that I really, growing up in private school, Connecticut, had no exposure to. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was just wild. I thought it was so exciting. And I also felt so important. Went back to law school, finished up, and decided not to go into the private sector as almost everybody else did, but to go into the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. It was there that I thought I could get the kind of experience that I was looking for, the excitement, the rush. I was able to work with the NYPD, the detectives, and I developed a niche for myself there as a domestic violence specialist and a sex crime specialist. And colloquially, they called me the crazy lady case specialist, which really meant that somehow along the way, I figured out that I was really good at dealing with women going through trauma. for some reason, I was able to sit down across the table from people who had suffered immense emotional, physical, sexual trauma and talk to them, really hold space for them, listen to them, support them, almost without training, right? Because although they train you to be a prosecutor, to be an investigator, the science of dealing with people in trauma and psychology and all of that was, utterly new to me. But I found it really engaging. It was really appealing to me. I had this sense that I was making a difference in that one person's life. And that it was life-changing, really. But it was also exhausting. There is a transference of the trauma when you are that close to it. And I had been that close to it for 7 years. I could clear a room at a party when somebody asked me, what do I do for a living? I suddenly would find myself alone, So I went into private practice. I did that for 3 years, but it wasn't really for me. I know myself well enough now that my cup of tea are people, right? So that didn't last terribly long. And I went back to criminal prosecution as a federal prosecutor in Vermont, in Burlington, Vermont. There I was the human trafficking specialist, and human trafficking there looked like the exploitation of young opiate-addicted women for commercial sex. So causing somebody to either become addicted to or exacerbate an addiction to heroin in order to pimp them out for sex and money, which obviously didn't go back to the person performing the sex act. And it was an amazing experience, but also a wildly dark one. And on a particularly dark day, I was at my desk on Facebook, just taking a break. Mm-hmm. And a friend of mine from the DA's office had posted on Facebook that she was now at the Global Fund and, hey, we're hiring. So I hit click. I wasn't looking for a new job. I wasn't looking to switch sectors at that point. But of course, I got the job, and I turned to my husband. I said, hey, you want to move our whole family to Geneva, Switzerland? And so we did. And I joined the OIG, Office of the Inspector General, as an investigator doing sexual exploitation and abuse. Well, they hired me to do sexual exploitation and abuse cases. They had not yet had one. But I think it was prescient because a few months later they did. And that was their first allegation, the Ghana case, as we call it, by leading them through that experience because they had never done that kind of an investigation before. There were findings. There were findings not only that were substantiated about what had happened in Ghana, but there were findings about the readiness of the organization. How ready was the Global Fund for the next episode of sexual exploitation, abuse, or harassment? Did we have the infrastructure? Did we have the organizational readiness? We decided that we did not. And one of the things that was born out of that was this unit that I now lead, the PSEAH coordination unit, which is a mouthful, so we shorten it to PCU.
And reflecting on your transition from being a US prosecutor to your current role in an international organization, what are some of the lessons learned or insights that you have from your previous role that you bring with you in this current environment?
So I think the thing that distinguishes me from my peers in the development and humanitarian sector in PSEAH is the sense that I come at it with a real practitioner lens. Mm-hmm. I have practiced law. I have sort of literally, as you say, sat across the table from people who have undergone the trauma, and I have been in the investigator seat. Mm-hmm. And so I have a real sense of the reality of it. I think that is different from a lot of people who grew up in the PSEAH movement, who either came from the GBV world or who came from the programmatic humanitarian world, because I say this with love. There is an element of sort of ivory tower or policy wonkiness that is different from somebody who has been in the trenches, so to speak. And I think that there is a realism and a practical application lens that I bring to this as a result of my background. And I hope I never lose that, because it allows me to zero in on the things that will actually make a difference,
right?
Turn that into action, and then also be really ready to just pivot, because when you're on the ground in the trenches, so much goes wrong, and you have to know how to turn and redirect. So I think having that agility is something that I hope I'll take with me forever. And the other thing is that the DA's office, there was something introduced to me around vicarious trauma. And that was this idea that was not talked about really in the sector then, certainly not among police officers, detectives, criminal prosecutors who were supposed to be the toughest people on earth. But this idea that when you are listening to somebody else recount their traumatic experience, you are also experiencing an element of trauma yourself. Honestly, there are things that I'll never unsee, right? And there are things that I can't unhear and things that come into my mind at moments when, I'm having an otherwise peaceful, loving, consensual, what have you, encounter with people in my life and whom I love and trust. But these things just are there for you, for me at least. And so being aware of the way this works on the practitioner and what we can do to protect ourselves is something that I have brought with me to the Global Fund. We have an SEAH wellness group that is loosely copied off of something that I did at the US Attorney's Office in Vermont, where monthly we get together with our staff counselor and we just do an informal wellness check-in and really give people the space and the place to talk about things that are either work-related or not, but with an awareness that dealing with SEAH as a practitioner can have an effect on you that is perhaps not expected by some. Yeah. So I think those are two gifts that I really have brought with me from my days as a criminal prosecutor.
Having those tools so that these types of functions can, sustain themselves and be sustainable in the long term, because you can very quickly burn yourself out in this work that can take a lot from you.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of ways it hits you, and sometimes it's not that you even perceive it to be heavy, but you're surrounded by such heaviness that you stop being able to relate to people who are not in that world, right? You sort of have this sense that everything else, every other conversation I have is so meaningless. It's not raw enough or important enough or something like that. And it's so then you're sort of isolated in this perpetual echo chamber of practitioners. And that's not healthy either, right?
With the Global Fund investing quite a significant amount, $60 billion annually in TB, HIV, and AIDS initiatives across different countries with vulnerable communities. These funds are managed by other organizations on the ground, and we call them in the international sector implementing partners or third parties. This substantial influx of funds and money into these vulnerable areas, one could argue that it increases the risk of sexual exploitation and abuse by healthcare workers or by aid workers. And that's due to the imbalance of power. In your opinion, how can we ensure that these funds are dedicated to healthcare and to prevent anyone from being coerced into exchanging sex for money or assistance?
It's a really good question. It's sort of my reason for being at the moment. Yeah. And I think what I want to say is that first and foremost, I think it's really important that we recognize out loud that we cannot 100% prevent sexual exploitation, sexual misconduct of any kind. We're just not going to be able to have that kind of success rate. So we have to be really upfront about that. We should not suggest that we can. But we have to make our best effort. We have to make our best effort to mitigate the risk of SEAH wherever we can. And we have to be ready to respond to SEAH when it is reported in a victim survivor-centered and trauma-informed way. So that is why the Global Fund has structured PSEAH the way it does. We style it as protection from sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So that protection from includes this spectrum of prevention, detection, response. So that's why the Global Fund has styled its PSEAH work as Protection from Sexual Exploitation, Abuse, and Harassment. And that includes the spectrum prevention, detection, response, which I try to think of these as a cycle, really, a symbiotic cycle. So one informs the next. And in prevention, we have our risk mitigation work, and we approach that in two ways. We approach risk mitigation through an organizational lens. What does the organization need, either the Global Fund or its implementing partners, in order to best mitigate the incidence of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, but also programmatically. And that really sets us apart also. What can we do at the Global Fund to help our implementers on the ground look at each program and say, in this program, in this particular grant, with this set of beneficiaries against the backdrop of this particular context, where are the risks? Where are the opportunities for exploitation? And what are we going to do to guard against that? So one of the things that we are doing with our risk mitigation work is really sitting down at the table with the beneficiaries of the program and the implementers of the program and the community members from our CCMs, country coordinating mechanisms, and members of my team to have that conversation. What is the local context? How does this program work? Where are the areas that are ripe for exploitation, and what can we do? And what is already in place? Because often there are already safeguards in place that we haven't called by that name, right? This is not a new topic. Sexual exploitation has been happening since history. And so it is important to recognize also that there are things that people have done to keep others safe, perhaps without even having named it. And then, of course, there's training and awareness, and that's critical. There has to be contextual messaging, understanding what is the local lexicon, what can be said, what shouldn't be said, what would appeal, what would not alienate, what would not cause more harm than good, in terms of helping people understand what this is, why it is wrong. In some places where corruption is so normalized, trading sex for something of value is just another form of corruption, right? I was interviewing a witness in the OIG. He said, where I come from, you have to use what you have to get what you want, right? It's just not a big deal. And that normalization of sexual exploitation is something that is very hard to work against. So the messaging has to be contextual. It has to be tailored to the local audience. And then capacity building, right? How can we help support our implementers develop the capacity they need so that they can take this on themselves, so they can really own it themselves? So that's prevention. And then we do detection as well. How can we help set up reporting channels that work in the local context? It's not enough to have an anonymous hotline that nobody uses for this purpose because it's not fit for purpose necessarily in an SEAH context. We don't typically pick up a telephone and call an anonymous number continent away to report something intimate and traumatic that happened to us, right? We tell our sisters, we tell our mothers, we tell our friends. So there is this aspect of detection that needs to happen. How can we create the trusted, safe places, systems that people will actually use in order to disclose, right? It's about capturing the disclosure. And then, of course, ensuring that the information goes to the right place so that organizationally we can respond within the partnership. And that's about reporting.
Do you have any examples? A reporting mechanism that worked?
I want to tell you about an example that didn't work because I think it's so interesting. And when you go to a lot of our implementers, you walk into the lobby and there's a box, like a complaints box, right? And it's often smack in the middle of the room. It's completely unprivate. It's generally locked. And when you ask, nobody knows who has the key and nobody knows how often it's checked. It's unclear whether it's even used at all. It's certainly not something you could do privately, right? In the Ghana case, there were many attempts by the victim survivors to report the sexual exploitation.
Oh.
They used the boxes. They told people in charge. They tried to talk about it in community groups. And for various reasons, they met with no response or disbelief or where's your evidence kind of response. They even went so far as to take it to a local radio show. And they went on a radio program and talked about this. There was so much fear and concern at the Global Fund around publication, which is what typically happens after the OIG does a report, an investigative report, for fear that, publicizing what had happened would be something that the victim survivors wouldn't want, would re-traumatize them, would hurt them in whatever way. And the truth is, and it's not the case across the board, of course, but in this particular case, these women wanted the story heard so badly that they had even taken to the local radio program in order to share what had happened to them because they had felt so unheard. And they had tried to report in all of the ways, and none of those ways worked. Really wasn't until the case was investigated administratively that they said to be believed, to be heard is an immense step towards healing in this way. And so I was, incredibly happy to be able to be part of that for them.
It's often how it happens, right? Like media being the middle person, the one who gives the voice to the voiceless. And unfortunately, that's where some of those organizations spoke up and made a change.
It can be a catalyst for change. That is demonstrably true.
So coming back to the framework you mentioned, you covered prevention, detection, and we went into the challenges of reporting that is part of detection. Then it leaves us with response, the last component of the framework.
And then finally, response. What does a victim-survivor-centered, trauma-informed investigation look like? What does victim-survivor support facilitation look like? How can you create trust in those systems? How can we better our communication to make it clear? How can we ensure that we have compassionate, skilled practitioners at the helm doing these investigations? All of these things create and are part of this prevention, detection, response cycle. And this is the way we are helping to equip our implementers. I would say that the theme that weaves its way through is partnership. So remember, I grew up in the human trafficking world in America, right? So they talk about the 4 Ps: prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. So that's sort of how I always have viewed the world. I think these things are very translatable. And partnership is really one of the hardest. It's hard to create these bridges between and among organizations. It's hard to create them even within your own organization.
Could you tell us why partnership is the most difficult one?
Prevention, protection, and prosecution are maybe the harder skills. Mm-hmm. And partnership is the softer skill, and one that hasn't been studied. It doesn't get as much attention because it doesn't have the concrete output that fits nicely into the annual report about all the risk mitigation work you're doing, or how many victim survivors you have given services to, right, or how many people have been prosecuted or cases investigated or what have you. Partnership sounds like a sort of nice to have.
Right.
But I think it is a means to the end here. Mm-hmm. I think we have to figure out how to leverage the respective powers of our organizations and join forces. I guess the other part of it that's really tricky, we are competing in some ways, right, for donor funds, mm-hmm, and trying to get an organization to let go of their 100% ownership of those donor funds, right, is a really complicated exercise because we all have to be good stewards of the money. We don't want to suggest that we have enough to share, mm-hmm, right? But in fact, we need to share them because this is a resource-limited environment. So we have to get better at that, right, communication, because it makes no sense to do it in any other way. But it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. Last year, during the WHO stakeholder meeting, you received the award of the PSEAH, so the Prevention to Sexual Exploitation Abuse Champion. And it's quite obvious with your story and your background that you deeply care about people and justice. Could you share with us what motivates this deep commitment to serve people?
I got the Perfect Partner Award, which I was really, really pleased about because, early on in WHO's journey, I had sat down with Gaia and her team and talked about, what is SEAH and how do we approach this? Just, they were at the very, very beginning stages, and helping them find their footing was awesome. It was really an incredible experience. But what motivates this commitment to serve people? So I think SEAH investigations and prosecutions require connecting intimately with extremely vulnerable people who have been taken advantage of. As we've talked about, many of them sought help in 100 places, have had the door shut in their faces for all sorts of reasons. And being the person who can open that door and help restore power and autonomy by using my admittedly very loud mouth to give voice to the voiceless is extremely rewarding. When you work this closely with people in trauma, you really feel that you're making a difference in an actual person's life, right? And that's a micro impact, and it's really hard not to feel good about it. But on a macro level, I think it's given me my sense of identity. It's given me my sense of self-worth and value in society. It's made me feel important, as if my contribution to the world matters.
Mm-hmm.
So it not only feels good, but it's become, I think, a vocation and also a way to earn a living. In some ways, it's inherently selfish, right? I get a lot of good feeling myself from doing the work. And so it drives me.
I think there's a lot of people who work for the humanitarian aid sector that has this two aspect where they want to serve, but in the same time, it makes them feel good about themselves. Thank you for being that vulnerable. I do have a question to you as we close off our conversation. You mentioned you have this deep understanding that what happens on the ground and what could actually happen to people, to the practitioners who are in the field and having to deal with that. And I'm sure some of our listeners are these practitioners. What would be your message to them in terms of coping with the heaviness that you experienced when you were a US prosecutor? It's a message that I think focal points or, technical officers who are working so tirelessly on this would really appreciate.
First, I would say, maybe do as I say and not as I do. It doesn't come naturally or easily to me. I have to deliberately take care of myself. I'm a natural caretaker of just about everybody else in the room, right? I give myself the shortest shrift. And I guess my message for anybody in the field working in this area would be deliberately engage with yourself, because find out what it is for you that will help. There's so many sources out there. We Google vicarious trauma on the internet and all the sorts of exercises and meditations and yoga and exercise and nature and candle lighting and you name it, it's out there. Something will work for you, right? Mm-hmm. But find the thing. Prioritize yourself, because in this work where we give and we give and we give and we give, we deplete. Mm-hmm. And if you don't find a way to fill yourself back up, then you will carry evidence of somebody else's trauma with you forever. There's really, we're human, right? Yeah. It's not in anyone's interest for you to do this work for 3 years and then have a breakdown, right? We need resilient, compassionate practitioners who aren't walled off emotionally, because that's the only way they can get through this. Mm-hmm. We need somebody who can engage, but also can be well, right? And help somebody else get well.
You're leaving us with great advice. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's really my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the World Health Organization's #NoExcuse podcast. We hope we've given you another perspective on preventing and responding to sexual misconduct in the humanitarian and development sectors. We release new episodes every 2 weeks. But if you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions in the meantime, feel free to reach out at PRSEAH@who.int. Until the next time, goodbye.